Hey guys, and welcome to another long awaited episode of Suit Up, the Warframe frame review series. Now there's been a lot of interest as to which frame I'm going to be doing next in this series, whether it was going to be Atlas or the long awaited Equinox. Today it's going to be neither of those, and we are instead going to take a look at a frame that, despite her fiery personality, always remained in the shadows, outclassed by most frames and getting very little playtime. We are of course going to be taking a look at the recently buffed Ember, and more specifically her Prime. Now, Ember as a frame has been in the game for a long time now, and she was given her Prime version towards the end of 2013, but for one reason or another she was overlooked constantly, as her abilities weren't really up to scratch for a long time. She got a buff in update 15.11 that did go some way to increasing her usability, but the confused nature of her world on fire made her a nightmare to mod for, with her needing literally everything to be able to get the most out of her. However, she got some more changes in update 17.5, which has really changed people's outlook on her. Now, although the Prime is currently only available in-game through the trade chat, that is going to be the focus of the video. So what stats are we looking at for the Prime version of Ember? Well, like most frames, her stats aren't really that outstanding, with 300 health at rank 30, 375 shield, 225 energy and 125 armor. The armor's not really high enough to mod around, where it's actually going to make a difference to her survivability, and other than that the other stats are fairly average, with nothing really jumping out as her primary stat to mod around, like Nova Prime or Volt Prime's energy for example. So it's Ember's abilities that really make her shine now, right? Well, yes, they are definitely what makes her what she is right now. So let's have a look at those abilities before we go into how we're going to build her. Ember's first ability is Fireball, where she launches a fiery projectile. It deals high fire damage on contact and moderate fire damage to any who enter the lingering flames. So basically what happens here is that Ember will throw a fireball at a target, dealing a pretty reasonable 400 heat damage, with a 100% chance to give a heat proc on impact. The damage done by the heat proc is 50% of the initial damage, ticking 7 times over 6 seconds. However, if the fireball hits the head of the enemy, it will tick 100% of the initial damage 7 times over 6 seconds. Fireball will also do a small AoE around the target, dealing 150 damage and a 50% chance to proc the fire proc on the enemies affected by that AoE. The heat proc is one of those that is actually fairly useful. When affected by a heat proc, an enemy will flail around in panic, pretty much meaning he's not shooting back at you. It's a pretty simple ability, not a lot to it, it's affected by nothing but power strength, so it is really easy to mod for, and can be used as cheap and easy crowd control on high priority targets like heavy units. Now it also comes with the option to use an augment mod for it, Fireball Frenzy. This mod can be picked up from the rank of General under Steel Meridian, or the rank of Exalted under the Red Veil, spending 25,000 reputation to purchase. What it does, it allows Fireball to be cast on allies. It must hit them directly, but it adds additional heat damage to their attacks. The percentage can be increased with the use of power strength mods and the duration by duration mods. Now this is one of those mods that is a bit hit or miss. In an organised group, you can really take advantage of that, especially when they mod their weapon accordingly. As you know, the majority of my Void builds use corrosive and heat, so this would buff the heat damage of that weapon, and additionally it will buff that damage. It will basically combine that buff when using Accelerant, so you'll get essentially a double buff from that. This mod in an uncoordinated group, however, can really backfire, especially if you don't know how their weapons are modded. For example, if you take my standard magnetic and toxin build for Corpus, casting Fireball Frenzy on that would cause the additional heat damage to combine with that toxin damage, forming gas damage, meaning you could end up forming an elemental combo that you don't really want, and wasting that heat damage, since they really can't use the extra heat damage to be buffed by Accelerant. It's not a terrible mod, that's for sure, and like I say, with a focused group based around that heat damage and Fireball Frenzy, it can actually be a pretty decent one. So far you've heard me mention Accelerant a couple of times now when talking about Fireball, and this is Ember's second ability. Ember stuns nearby enemies with a strong Accelerant, increasing all fire damage dealt. This is another very simple ability. Ember will release a wave of energy stunning all enemies hit by the wave for 5 seconds, and multiplying all heat damage done to the affected targets by 250%. A secondary effect of the Accelerant is that all casting done by Ember, once Accelerant has been cast, will be decreased. This is a really simple ability. The percentage increase of heat damage is increasable by power strength, and although duration doesn't increase the amount of time the enemies will be stunned, it does increase the duration of the cast speed. Now, Accelerant doesn't come with an augment, although I suspect it won't be too long before we see the final wave of the frame augment mods. Accelerant is an incredible ability, and one that is really a staple ability on Ember. The stun that comes with it and the stun that it provides is absolutely fantastic, and the damage increase on heat damage just means there is some real synergy between the frames, the weapons you're running with, and the rest of her powers. It's a very underrated ability, and one that I use very, very often whilst playing as Ember. Her third ability is Fire Blast, where she slams the ground for high damage in a small radius and creates a persistent ring of fire, which deals high damage over time. Basically, she hits the ground, spawns a ring of fire around her. There is a wave that expands outwards, dealing 200 heat damage, with a 100% chance to proc the heat proc, causing them to flail around. Further to that, in the same spot, she spawns a more permanent ring of fire 4 meters wide. Enemies inside this second ring will take 225 heat damage per second. As you can expect, all damage is affected by power strength, including the wave. The duration of the inner ring is affected by power duration. Crazily enough though, this ability is not affected by range at all, which is slightly bizarre as you would think this type of ability would be. It's not a terrible ability, the crowd control from the fire procs isn't too bad, and the area denial of the damage over time isn't horrendous either, and can be used effectively on something like Infested Defense, where they run into the ring to try and attack the pod. It's not the world's strongest ability. The damage drops off fairly quickly, not to mention that a static ring on the floor of only 4 meters wide is going to do absolutely nothing against ranged enemies, provided that they're stupid enough to walk in it. The most effective part of this ability is that wave of fire procs, but realistically, if you want something to do an AoE crowd control, just use Accelerant. Fire Blast also comes with an augment, Fire Fright, where it has a 100% chance to cause panic to all enemies that take damage from the inner ring of Fire Blast. This mod can be gained by attaining the rank of General under Steel Meridian, or the rank of Exalted under the Red Veil, and spending 25,000 reputation to purchase. The mod doesn't seem to be affected by anything at all, and honestly, it's a garbage mod of the highest proportion. It only affects enemies that are damaged by the inner ring of Fire Blast. So basically it's got literally no effect on ranged units whatsoever, unless they're stupid enough to walk through that swirling circle of fire. Even the enemies that you would think that it would have the most effect on, the infested, just doesn't seem to do anything at all half the time. The panic seems to last for about 5 seconds, if it even triggers at all. I have no idea if the augment is just terrible, or if it's actually not working properly. But for me, it just doesn't seem to do anything at all. Not worth the mod slot or the reputation needed to buy it. So Ember's fourth and final ability, World on Fire, has been changed so many times it's hard to keep up with it all. But with this ability, once again, she slams her hand into the ground, she deals 400 heat damage to 5 enemies within a radius of Ember, and then 400 heat damage per explosion to enemies within that same range. Each explosion has a 35% chance to proc the heat proc on enemies. Now, honestly, it's a very simple ability, although it doesn't really sound like it's going to be. The damage of the ability and also the status chance percentage are affected by power strength. The range of ability is affected by power range. And now World on Fire is a purely toggleable ability. It relies on both duration and efficiency to keep the cost of the ability to a minimum. Now, I'm going to link to a Reddit article in the description of the video below, talking about the relationship between duration and efficiency. And honestly, I can make a video on it in the future if you guys want me to do something like that. But for this purpose of this video, I'll link the article below. Now, once World on Fire has been activated and it's in use, you cannot receive any energy from like Energy Pizzas, Energy Vampire, or even Banish or Cataclysm. you will need to rely solely on finding those blue energy balls to keep it going. Now it's important to remember that once that initial 5 targets are hit upon cast, only one explosion at a time can happen, and it will prioritise enemies that are close to you, meaning that you don't have any real control over this ability whatsoever. The actual damage it does when it procs heat though, once again 50% of the base damage, ticks 7 times over 6 seconds. It's, like I say, once again, another very simple ability. Does pretty decent damage at low levels, falls off fairly fast at those higher levels, but combine it with Accelerant and you can blitz exterminate missions in super quick time, replacing Sarin as the super quick exterminate runner that she was before. Now, World on Fire does come with an augment Firequake. I've actually done a review on this mod before, and I will link it to you in the description below. The main difference from that video now is beforehand I didn't take into account just how effective a negative power strength ranged Firequake build was, and how much of a help it can be in those higher end missions. Now since I made that video, the changes to World on Fire happened, with it finally having that duration cap removed. It means that you can actually fit the mod into your build fairly easily, but my conclusion still stands. It's a fantastic mod, definitely worth being put into your build. It works almost like Ember's personal shield, and it is way more reliable than just hoping your World on Fire procs that heat proc. It can be, and has been, a lifesaver many times. Okay, so let's move on to starting to mod Ember Prime. Now, as standard, she comes with a V polarity as her aura, but she also comes with a V and a D polarity as standard. Now, the first thing we're going to do is add 3 former, which is to change the aura to a dash. We're going to add another V and a D in here. Now, I've got 3 builds for sort of 3 different situations. This first build is more revolving around the Firequake and making sure that we've got the most out of that. So we're going for Corrosive Protection as the aura, Handspring for the extra the knockdown recovery. It's very useful. You're back up on your feet almost immediately. We've got Redirection and Vitality as our survivability mods, Fleeting Expertise at rank 4, and also Streamline for the efficiency. Stretch, which is going to increase the range of all of our abilities. We've got Prime Continuity on here, which is going to increase the duration of things like Accelerant. It's also going to help with the drain on World on Fire. And we've got Transient Fortitude in here, which is going to increase the damage buff from Accelerant. It's going to increase the damage of our World on Fire as well. And then we've got Firequake in here, which is the augment for World on Fire. It's going to make sure every single enemy that gets hit with an explosion gets knocked down, so you don't have to rely on the status chance and the potential to proc status on that one guy. Now, the second build, it's fairly similar. In fact, it's exactly the same, except we're going to be changing the Firequake out for an Intensify, and we'll change to Mobilize for the Exilus slot. And the reason for that is this is pretty much my speedrunning exterminate nuking build. We've got the extra damage here for the World on Fire. Mobilize is going to help us move around that bit quicker. And this is just a very good all-round build for just speedrunning those non-endless missions. And then if you want to do a sort of support kind of Ember, I'll go with Corrosive Protection, Handspring. I'll go Intensify for a little bit of power strength. Redirection Vitality, Fleeting Expertise, Streamline once again, Stretch, Prime Continuity, so the majority are pretty much the same here again. And then we got Fireball Frenzy, which means you can see we've got 105% duration here and 130% strength, which basically means you're going to get about 130% on the fire damage. You're going to get just over 40 seconds on the Fireball Frenzy, which means you can be really fairly good as a support frame, really buffing the heat damage, combining it with your Accelerant. It's just a really fantastic all-round sort of support build. And something that actually I haven't used very often, but in a very tight-knit group where you know how everyone's going to be modding, everyone's going to be modding for fire damage, you really can focus that heat damage coming out of Ember, and it can actually be a very strong combo. So is Ember Prime and also the standard Ember worth the time and effort and resources to max it out? And I would say that she is definitely worth it. Ember's always been one of those frames that has been in the game and only used by a select few, with many crying out for buffs. The amusing thing recently is that people started to realise that how she plays and how effective as a support frame she actually can be. The damage increase, the stun from Accelerant, the fire procs or the knockdown from World on Fire and Firequake. She is actually a very good support frame, maybe not as strong as some of the other ones, but definitely usable if you use her in the right situations. In terms of running exterminates and other quick missions like that with her, there are very, very few that can run them as fast as Ember does right now. If you combine that with a heat-based Ignis build and Accelerant whilst running through those quick missions with World on Fire active, she absolutely demolishes low to mid-end content right now. But the thing is with Ember, she's not what people would class as an endgame frame. Now it's true that the damage buff and the stun are useful, but at those higher levels the one at a time nature of World on Fire and Firequake just isn't enough crowd control to compete with a mass crowd control effect like Molecular Prime, Radial Disarm or even Chaos. But the thing is, after all the pushing and shoving about whether Ember is good enough, honestly I think she's in a pretty good place right now. She is definitely a low to mid level content frame, and honestly there's nothing wrong with that. Not all frames have to be suitable for every single situation. What Ember is right now is a fantastically fun frame to play, worth a second look if you write her off before. She might just surprise you. And as always guys, I hope you enjoyed this episode of Suit Up. This should become a more regular thing once again, so stay tuned every Wednesday for another episode. So thanks very much for watching, and I shall see you in that next episode.